Well, good evening, everybody. I guess when we do the questions, we'll put the house lights up because I actually can't see anybody. Welcome. As you know, we're very privileged to have Paul Wells with us tonight. Paul is the political editor of Maclean's magazine. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. He was born in Sarnia. He played trumpet in his high school jazz band, which explains why every summer Paul would disappear from the Gazette, from his political beat, for 2 weeks to cover the Montreal Jazz Festival. He graduated from Western, so he got the color right, he just got the university wrong. A BA in political science, and after that he began his career in journalism at the Gazette. Midway through his time at the Gazette, he took a pretty bold decision and left for a year to go study in Paris at l'Institut d'études politiques de Paris. He came back, and in 1994, I happened to be the publisher of the Gazette, and I think one of the best decisions that we made during my 7 years in that role was to ask Paul to go to Ottawa and become our political columnist. He was pretty young, I think, and inexperienced at that point, but there was just a great sense of his potential, and he's just gone from strength to strength ever since that time, and I think, as you know, he's one of Canada's, I think, most insightful political commentators. Paul joined Maclean's in 2003. He spent most of his time in Ottawa, but he did actually go back to Paris as the Maclean's European correspondent for a year. He's the author of Right Side Up, The Fall of Paul Martin and the Rise of Stephen Harper's New Conservatism. And his most recent book is The Longer I'm Prime Minister, Stephen Harper and Canada. Actually won the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing back in 2014. So we're really privileged to have Paul here so soon after the election. I don't think that he's probably had a whole lot of sleep since Monday. The way that we've agreed that we're going to proceed is I'm going to ask Paul some questions, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. Vous pouvez évidemment poser vos questions en anglais ou en français. So just before we start, I want to do a special shout out and welcome to our newly elected Member of Parliament, Marie-Claude Bibeau. Until Monday, Marie-Claude was the director of the Musée de la Nature et de la Science de Sherbrooke. She is now the newly elected Member of Parliament for our riding, Compton-Stanstead. So I can't actually see you, Marie-Claude, but could you stand up, and we'd like to... Where is she? Where is she? I'd also like to thank John Donald, as you know, our distinguished alumnus who has made this lecture series possible and allowed us to bring outstanding speakers to the university every year. This lecture is being streamed both by Bishop's and Maclean's. So hello to alumni and friends. Hello to John, if he's watching, I hope he is. And to John, I just want to say once again how grateful we are to you. So let's get going. The way that Paul and I agreed that we would do this is we're going to kind of do it party by party, just to talk about the campaign and what worked and what didn't, and then we'll come back around and talk about Justin Trudeau and the new Liberal government. As many of you know, the campaign started in its earliest days with Paul interviewing the party leaders in the first leaders' debate. And I think it's fair to say, Paul, that at that point, Justin Trudeau was probably in third place. The Tories had inundated the country with the Justin's Just Not Ready campaign, and I don't think anyone was predicting a Liberal majority. So can you tell us how he did it?
Well, it was easy. Piece of cake. I'll just say briefly, it's an honor to be here as part of the Donald Lecture Series, and it's always a pleasure to be at Bishop's University. I don't come back enough, and it does remind me of Western. not only chronographically, but demographically. So certain things in common. We were reminded, I just finished last night at 9 o'clock writing my sort of, the stunt piece that I do after every election, which is I write 20,000 words about how the election was won or lost, and it appears in the next issue of Maclean's. It'll be on our website tomorrow and in our digital products tonight and on newsstands tomorrow. And I was reminded as we were doing that, yeah, the Liberals were not only in trouble, they were in increasing amounts of trouble, as David Hurley, a consultant to the Liberal campaign, said. We weren't just in third place, we had negative momentum. They needed to do three things. They needed to stabilize Justin Trudeau personally. They needed him to stop becoming more unpopular. They needed to get their message out, and then they needed to prosecute that message and the difference between the Liberals and not only the Conservatives, but also the New Democrats. Because remember, when the campaign started, the New Democrats were in first place and continuing to climb. The two elements of the stabilization phase, we had to stabilize the patient, were our Maclean's debate and the intervention of a third party who at that point in the campaign was much likelier to get press coverage than Justin Trudeau was, and that was Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario. So our debate. The Liberals didn't like anything about our debate. They had been Justin Trudeau had been rehearsing for debates since February of this year, and they had been doing research and scripting on the debates since last November. They thought they knew what debate they were preparing for. They were preparing for the traditional broadcast network consortium debates that would happen within a couple weeks before voting day. They did not like the notion of a fly-by-night operation, a magazine putting on a rogue debate in the dead of summer, well before the campaign was supposed to start, moderated by a bit of a crazy guy who had written 2 books about Stephen Harper. So it took some doing. And frankly, the known rationale for having a bunch of debates was that the New Democrats and the Conservatives were persuaded that the more debates they had on serious matters, the more of a flyweight Justin Trudeau would look. That was not my interest. That was not Maclean's corporate interest. But if they wanted to have a lot of debates to make him look silly, and we wanted to have a debate, there was a Venn intersection of our interests, and it was good enough. He did rehearse diligently for debates. He also was on the McGill Debating Club many moons ago when he was an undergrad at McGill. Debating club tends to teach as many poor habits as good habits. You tend to be kind of strutting and stentorian and my worthy opponent, and so his staff spent several months pounding that out of him and getting him to speak approximately conversationally. And then it went really well. The first segment was on the economy. It was at a period when the economy seemed very unsettled. And the first question, by the luck of the draw, was to Justin Trudeau. And the first leader to rebut Mr. Trudeau was Stephen Harper. And so we were really excited when that was the luck of the draw, because that was what we would have had as our drug. Put Trudeau on the spot, make Harper sweat him. That was ideal. And I'm told that in that corner of the Liberal campaign where they were watching the debates, when he got through that first question, there was cheers and sighs of gratitude and so on. And then the debate went fairly well from then on for all parties. I believe everyone got their points out. And then there came this sort of long, drawn-out closing remarks where each of them had 2 minutes to make their closing points. At the request of Elizabeth May, the Green Party leader, she wanted a long closing remark in case I didn't let her talk for the whole rest of it. And so, and Trudeau's was back to debating club Trudeau. It was a little hokey, it was a little dramatic, and I learned later, in Liberal Party voter market research afterwards, focus groups, dial groups, things like that, they asked, after asking, moment by moment, did you like this, did you not like this, they asked an open-ended question, what do you remember from the debate? And About 4 or 5 of the participants in the dial group said that, well, Trudeau's closing remark was hokey and sentimental and fake and gross. And about a dozen said it was fantastic and I wanted to cry and I love my country. And no more than 2 people remembered any other part of the debate. So he was off to the races. And from that moment on, he started to do a little bit better in the polls. I'm droning on, but I do want to say the Kathleen Wynne thing is fascinating because when Kathleen Wynne who was the Liberal Premier of Ontario and succeeded a 10-year Premier named Dalton McGuinty, when she ran for re-election last year, both the provincial Conservatives and the federal Conservatives decided it would be fun to try and beat her. So the Harper government campaigned quite actively against her, and she won. And then they decided in the early rounds of this campaign that it would be a really good idea that Justin Trudeau was barely worth campaigning against, so they would just campaign against Kathleen Wynne again. And the evidence of Monday night is pretty resounding that she won again. I don't know Ms. Wynne well, but I'll tell you, she is as partisan as Stephen Harper, as eager to fight, and as dangerous to underestimate. And the federal Conservatives have now learned that lesson twice.
Do you think that clearly Justin Trudeau was underestimated by the Tories, as you're saying, but I think did you say he was underestimated by the NDP as well? And did that?
Yeah, and there's some head scratching among campaign professionals about why the NDP didn't go harder against Justin Trudeau, especially about 3 or 4 weeks in the campaign when it became clear that he was rising, not like a rocket, at a snail's pace, just about a point a week, and sometimes a week would go by and he wouldn't go up his point. I mean, it was very modest. But at midway in the campaign, he was a danger to the New Democrats, because in a change election, the change voter just wants change. They just want not Stephen Harper, and so they're shopping around. And if the Liberals rose enough, then a lot of people who were perfectly happy to vote New Democrat would suddenly be perfectly happy to leave the NDP and vote Liberal. And so why didn't the NDP turn their guns on Trudeau, as the Conservatives expected? And the answer is, we had Anne McGrath at a lunch event today. She was the campaign director for the NDP. She said their own voters got very skittish and very upset at them whenever they criticized Trudeau. Because their own voters weren't actually their own voters. They were change voters who were parked with the NDP. So, plus a large number of NDP loyalists. But go after Justin Trudeau, and your own voters don't say, that's right, get him. They say, what are you doing? Stephen Harper's the target. And so they had very limited room to maneuver.
So why do you think that the NICAB issue caused such problems for Mulcair and Trudeau seemed to be unaffected by it?
It's because there's a great jazz piano player named Thelonious Monk. I'm the jazz festival guy. Incidentally, when the Andre Leroux Quartet comes here from Montreal next month, you should go. He's a fantastic saxophonist. Thelonious Monk used to play very weird, and he used to say to other musicians in his band, if you make a mistake, play it loud. And that boldness comes more naturally to Trudeau than it does to Mulcair. Mulcair comes from the Quebec National Assembly, where identity issues and reasonable accommodation have been debated for a long time, and understands that sentiments on all sides are deeply held and deeply felt, and it was reluctant to, knew that he was putting out a lot of his MPs, whatever position he took, and so he soft-pedaled things a little bit. Trudeau is a liberal. He's the son of Trudeau. He arguably didn't know any better, didn't know the complexities of the issue in Quebec, and so he was very loud, and he came out early. When the question was, should FIFA League soccer players play with a turban a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, Trudeau came out hard, said, absolutely, play with the turban, it's not a big deal. When Pauline Marois was running on the Charter of Values, Trudeau was the first national leader to come out and say the Charter of Values don't reflect our values in the Liberal Party. And so he was inoculated against surprise when he took his position. Whereas the NDP, especially in Quebec where it had most of the seats, was an amorphous big tent that was maybe nationalist, maybe federalist, maybe a party of Québécois de souche, maybe a party of urban diversity. It was kind of everything. And the NICAB issue was the sort of one that would cause a portion of NDP support to say, well, I didn't know you were about that. Whereas if you were with Trudeau, you were likely urban rather than rural. You'd heard him talk on these issues before, and it came as less of a surprise.
Right. One of my colleagues said to me today that about Justin Trudeau that he may not be as smart as his dad, but he clearly connects with Canadians. And I know we've tended to see this election as this construct was stability versus change, but I'm wondering in the end whether this wasn't also an election about whatever you deem Canadian values to be, that it was in fact an election about people's definition of what they see as Canadian values.
Yeah, and that was a very difficult thing for the Conservatives, because the Conservatives have spent a decade, 12 years really, since Harper became the leader of the new combined Conservative Party in 2004, seeking to advance the argument that conservative values are Canadian values, that patriotism and family and strong communities and safe streets and entrepreneurialism, respect for skilled trades, you could go on and on and on, are all as Canadian and as respectable and as wonderful as Charter of Rights and Medicare and a bunch of things that are more strongly associated with the Liberals. And they lost the values argument pretty resoundingly in this election, which I don't think is the same as proving any existential case that conservative values are lousy values. I just think in running a bad campaign, in seizing the Syrian refugee and the NICAB issues and deciding that it would be a good idea to turn that into sort of a bundle of arguments around identity and accommodation and immigration, and then going wildly overboard with it. At some point, it began to resemble, in ways I find disappointing, the PQ re-election effort in Quebec last year, where a lot of people might be disturbed and upset that a woman believes she's required to cover her face in public. A lot of people might prefer that not be the case. And a lot of people might even support public policies that seek to influence those choices by forbidding those choices in some settings. But if that's all a government can talk about, it just at some point it starts to be upsetting. I have people close to me, family, who agreed with the Conservatives on being concerned about security if there were an influx of Syrian refugees, who agreed that during the one moment when you announce that you're proud to be Canadian, you should show your face while you're doing it. And then by the second or third week of this, snitch lines and revoking citizenship of convicted terrorists, only if they're dual citizens, as though there were two flavors of Canadian citizenship, and kind of on and on and on. It started to be just weird, like, hey, over here we've got an economy, over here we have international relations, we've got trade, we've got industrial policy. Could you stop it with the things about the people, like what, And so I just think they over-egged the custard, as we say.
So there was this supposed political guru from Australia who, advised Cameron, and do Do you think he was a significant factor in this pushing that wedge politics, maybe just, as I think you're suggesting, simply too far?
Yeah.
Does that come from Harper himself, or, I mean, sometimes one thinks these advisors have tremendous impact, and maybe they don't.
Michael is referring to Lynton Crosby, who is an Australian-born political strategist who was influential in the election of John Howard and then of Tony Abbott in Australia, and then became a sort of global electoral consultant, the way a lot of the people around Clinton and around Obama have done, just sort of putting out their shingle and helping people win elections around the world. He helped get Boris Johnson elected Lord Mayor of London. He helped David Cameron win his re-election earlier this year, with a surprising margin. And partway through the campaign, we heard that Lynton Crosby was going to be playing on the federal Conservative campaign. It has plausibility to it because there's a loose affiliation, a global network of Anglosphere conservative parties that trade best practices and notes and sometimes campaign personnel from country to country. New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and Canada. They've been, Australians helped Harper get elected, Canadians went and returned the favor for Tony Abbott. And Jason Kenney has known Lynton Crosby for several years. Now, we may have gotten too excited about this story. The more we report it, the less Lynton Crosby there was in this campaign. And it became entertaining at the end. Whenever anyone did anything in the Conservative Party, somebody would come on Twitter and say, well, this is the mad genius of Lynton Crosby. And I promise you that in almost every case it was not. So the tip line on barbaric cultural practices, that comes from a citizenship brochure that the Immigration Department under Jason Kenney published in 2011. And it had the phrasing barbaric cultural practices. And Justin Trudeau criticized that phrasing. And Jason Kenney did a bunch of interviews about Justin Trudeau doesn't know what's barbaric and doesn't and what's not. And Trudeau ended up apologizing. And so all that was they wanted to refight that fight because they loved how it ended the first time. It had nothing to do with an Australian genius. He became sort of like Kaiser Soze in The Usual Suspects. There'd be so many rumors about the man. My understanding is that he was never physically in Canada. You know, never report a good story too hard.
So let's just spend a little bit more time on the Tory campaign. They must have gone into this knowing that a majority of Canadians were looking for change. So, but they must have figured. So I'd like to hear you talk through what do you think their strategy was to get to victory, knowing that was probably the ballot question when the election began. Was if the question was, do you want Stephen Harper to continue to be the Prime Minister of Canada? It was pretty clear the majority of Canadians would have said no to that from the beginning.
Yeah.
The Tories clearly knew that. So what was their strategy? You talked about the 78-day campaign to try and expose Trudeau.
Yeah. So first of all, each party was trying to do something impossible. Harper was trying to win a fourth consecutive election victory. The last person to do that was Wilfrid Laurier a century ago. Conrad Black wrote in the National Post, he's trying to win a fourth consecutive election. The only other leaders who've done that in the country's history are John Macdonald and Wilfrid Laurier, and he is distinguishable from them. Justin Trudeau was trying to reverse a decade and a half of decline in the Liberal Party. They'd lost 80% of the seats that they held when Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister. And he was trying to go from third to first. He would need to quadruple the number of seats to get a majority. And I mean, until this week, I would say that in speaking appearances, and people would chuckle at the implausibility of it. And Tom Mulcair was simply trying to become the first NDP Prime Minister. So whoever won was going to be pulling a rabbit out of a hat. The long campaign was part of their goal, not just because Harper had run 4 previous campaigns and was good at it, and the others were going to be rookies and were going to make rookie mistakes, but also because a change to the election laws allowed parties to spend money proportionately as the campaign lengthened. So the longer the campaign was, the more money you could spend. And if you double the length of the campaign, there's only one party in the country that has that kind of cash, and it's the Conservatives. So the sense was that in the home stretch, they would have some money socked away and they could spend when everyone else was bankrupt. And then finally, if you talk about your issues, then and you can succeed in getting everyone to talk about your issues, it doesn't matter if the other person has some strength on something you're not, So if the election was about change, then he would be in trouble. If the election was about economic security, about the sense that we have it good here, but these are fragile gains and we need to protect them, then he had a chance. He was well aware that he could lose. And I spoke to a member of the government who chatted about this with the Prime Minister a few months before the election started. And Harper said, there's nobody else who's obviously ready. And I think I can beat these guys. So he didn't go into it with illusions that it was going to be a cakewalk. But he thought he had a plan.
Paul, you've written a lot about Stephen Harper. I know it's early days, but do you have an initial sense of to what extent what his legacy will be? Has he changed the country in some fundamental ways?
I'm told he's planning to write memoirs. I think that's a really healthy development. He's so secretive. It's not like I was hanging out with the guy. I mean, like every other journalist in the country, I had to wait in line to be snubbed. But he's a thoughtful person, and if you read his writings, really from before he became Prime Minister, when he felt free to write about political ideas and political strategy, I really hope that he explains himself, and it'll be better than my attempts to explain him. He re-legitimized conservatism in this country. He really re-legitimized a conservatism of people who think of themselves as conservatives. In the Progressive Conservative Party, under Brian Mulroney to some extent, and under Joe Clark to a great extent, the Palace Guard was, around the leader, was frankly embarrassed of people who went to church and talked about it, hunted and liked to hunt, preferred their taxes low rather than Ottawa's ambitions high, and you could go down the list. In the early days of the Mulroney government in the 80s, there was a member of parliament named Felix Holtman who was he was a pig farmer, and he was described every single time as Felix Holtman, the pig farmer, who wondered why the CBC played Beethoven because Beethoven was German, and so my lot, sort of elitist central Canadian journalists, would laugh and laugh and laugh about Felix Holtman. I was an undergrad at the time. But the thing that a lot of conservatives across the country noticed was that Brian Mulroney's staff would laugh about Felix Holtman, and they would make sure that he was never too close to the Prime Minister. And, and the thing is, there are millions of Canadians who think these thoughts and have these values, and they're good Canadians, and they're trying their best. And they wondered why Ottawa never seemed to want them around. And the way I formulated in the second book is that there's often a tendency between a party's militant base and the political mainstream. There's often a tension. There's often conflict. And Clark and Mulroney were eternally apologizing to the center for the excesses of their base. And Harper would always apologize to his base for the eccentricities of the center. And they noticed it, and that's why 30% of the electorate voted for him this time and would vote for him next time if they could. And that's why he leaves with nearly 100 MPs, whereas the Conservatives in '93 left with two. So that's important. On policy, he made limited government legitimate, and he made ambitious government have to explain itself and justify itself. It is no longer automatic that the next big program is a good idea and seen as a good idea. It will have to pay its rhetorical way by persuading large numbers of Canadians that it's a good idea. Justin Trudeau just showed that more ambitious, more expensive, bigger government can win, but it has to win in a tougher fight than it used to. Federal-provincial relations, Harper kept up transfers to the provinces and didn't do things in Ottawa that are constitutionally in the domain of the provinces. And while premiers didn't like him any better than anyone else did as a person, I think tensions in the Federation declined as he was Prime Minister. Finally, foreign policy and trade. There's a lot of room to argue about a lot of his foreign policy choices, but he, as Mulroney did, reaffirmed Canada as a serious free trading country that isn't just rhetorically free trading, but is actually out there on the ground all the time, trying to look for ways to reduce trade barriers. And that's that's a minimal case for Harper. I could go on, but
okay. So with his announcement that he's going to be stepping down as leader, they're obviously going to be into a leadership campaign. Do you think that there's going to be, do those two components of the Conservative Party, or the Conservative and the Progressive Conservative Party, are they going to be fighting once again for the leadership of that party, or do you think that it's permanently in the way that you characterized what Mr. Harper brought the Conservatives to be?
So most Conservatives who are older than about 30 remember when they were Progressive Conservatives or members of the Reform and Alliance parties. And the danger has always been that it would polarize along that fault line. And that's something that could have materialized if the two prominent leadership candidates had been Jason Kenney and Jean Charest, for instance. My reliable information is that Charest's not interested. We'll see whether Kenney is. Most of the time, Conservatives don't divide operationally in Ottawa along that fault line. It was always interesting to watch Conservative policy conferences held every 2 years. I think it was a typical Harper mistake to progressively reduce media coverage of their political campaigns, political conventions. Calgary, at the height of the Duffy scandal at the end of 2013, the Calgary Biennial Policy Convention, it was absurd. There was a strip of carpet at the back of the room, and if a journalist walked off the strip of carpet, then thugs in blue would come and usher you out of the hall. And the thing is, we should have been allowed to see what was going on, which is that the party, as had happened 2 years earlier at the Conservative Convention in Ottawa, the party was dividing again and again and again. A lot of policy resolutions were standing and falling on close votes, but they were different factions, different coalitions of Conservatives on opposite sides of different issues. It was not lining up again and again and again, Reform PC. It was rural urban, it was libertarian, social conservative. It was a healthy set of debates among people who believed themselves that they were all in a party together. And I think that's another of Harper's great successes. I believe there'll be tensions if Peter MacKay runs for the leadership. He's not going to have an awful lot of social conservatives supporting him. Right. But I don't think the party is in serious danger of dividing or even durably having hard feelings set in, as long as the leadership contenders remember that for the last decade it's felt like one party.
Okay. All right, let's talk about the NDP. They went into the campaign looking like they were in the lead, and at one point they were quite significantly ahead. And when I just wrote a couple of things down about Tom Mulcair, I think people would agree he's smart, he's articulate, he's perfectly bilingual. Some people were saying he was the most bilingual candidate all of them, certainly more experienced than Justin Trudeau. He moved his party to the center on economic issues. He took a principled position on the niqab. He kept a large and inexperienced caucus united. He was, some people said, one of the outstanding parliamentarians, not just of this parliament, but of many parliaments.
Brian Mulroney said that, yeah.
Right? And he was all about change, and yet it all fell apart. So what's your analysis?
It's heartbreaking for New Democrats because I don't think they did anything big wrong. Except maybe this. Yeah, but it wasn't like he said something dumb on it. Like, it's not the sort of thing you could rewind and just take back. They decided that, like, not only were they first in 103 ridings in 2011, they were second in 120, 30 more. And they told themselves that they were, like, this close to a broad national governing coalition, that it had to be a different kind of NDP. That had a lot to do with their choosing Mulcair as the leader, the sense that they couldn't go back to a left that made labor movement social democrats feel good, that had to go onward to an NDP that could govern. So who's the next voter if you're in that world? The next voter is someone who's never voted NDP before, who's a little nervous about these crazy people in orange, and needs to be coaxed and lulled. So when people said that Mulcair was boring, when people said he had a creepy smile, it was like a lot of the criticisms of Obama in the United States after Obama got elected president. Mm-hmm. The yes we can Hollywood celebrity Obama supporters and the columnists in the Nation magazine and Rachel Maddow on MSNBC and the sort of young intellectual left in the United States has been consistently disappointed with Obama because he never gets angry at injustice. He never urges people to rise up and change things. He's weirdly sort of mentholated, and the answer is because he understands that when he gets angry, people who aren't sure they like Barack Obama get angry back at him. It reinforces a bunch of lousy stereotypes about angry black men, that there's nothing to be gained from that, and that's why he's no drama Obama. And the NDP decided that Mulcair had to be no drama Obama too. And so when the conservatives were running ads or putting out whispering campaigns before the election saying, well, you know, he used to be a liberal, and they called him a professional politician or a career politician, and the idea was to portray him as a man without conviction. The NDP really liked that because the next voter they wanted to get was a voter without particular conviction. And the problem is you leave yourself exposed on your left flank.
Right.
I'm told the Liberals didn't go for deficit spending, which was their big sort of trademark of an ambitious big government agenda. They didn't do that tactically in the moment to outflank Mulcair on the left. They had been planning to do that for many months. They had been thinking about the deficit pledge for a year and finally came to ground on it well before the campaign started. They thought Mulcair would be there too. And they were astonished and delighted when Mulcair went to their right rather than them going to his left. But beyond that, well, no, he was fantastic in the debates. He was dangerous. He was superbly briefed. He was very good at morning campaign events at random candidates' campaign offices. He took questions from reporters until we were just out of questions. There was no cap on the number of questions we could ask him. The answers were good in French and English. But people shopped around and they went somewhere else. It's announced today that Mr. Mulcair will stay on as NDP leader. I think that's healthy for the party. You know, in the home stretch, people were like, well, Tom Mulcair wasn't the right leader. The actual real world alternatives to Mulcair in the NDP leadership convention of 2012 were Nathan Cullen and Brian Topp, So if you think Nathan Cullen or Brian Topp would have done better than Tom Mulcair in this campaign, then you're right, he was a bad leader. But
One of my colleagues sent me a question he wanted to ask you, and it's about the NDP, and he was saying, you know, if you leave the strategy and tactics aside, is there some lesson here about Canadians' view of the NDP? And I guess the question in that is, can it be, are they so stuck with the perception? I was in an event on the weekend and Bob Rae was there, and we were talking baseball. And he said, well, you know, when he was premier, that's the last time the Blue Jays won the World Series. And he said he once stood up in Parliament and took credit for that, and of course was criticized for it. And he said, well, you know, I get the blame for the world recession that was going on when I was premier. Why shouldn't I get credit when the Blue Jays won the World Series? And, you know, and we just keep constantly hearing that the legacy of Bob Rae in Ontario has made it almost impossible for the NDP to win at the national level. Do you think that's true?
So, two things. It took Jack Layton 4 consecutive elections to get the Orange Wave of 2011. Brad Levine, who helped run those campaigns, has written a valuable book called Building the Orange Wave. And the central victory of that book is that it's not a memoir of the last 3 weeks when everything was great. It's a reminder of how disappointing the 2004, 2006, and 2008 elections were for the NDP. They won. They gained about a point they gained 5 points in their. I'm very nearly making these numbers up. I mean, they gained 5 points in of popular vote in his first campaign in 2004, but then they went up like a point in 2006 and a point in 2008, when they were quite sure they were going to have breakthroughs, and they didn't have the breakthroughs. That's why it's good. It's good if Mulcair stays until the next election. Canadians will be more used to him and more comfortable with him, and he can be a little bit more of a leader for the NDP and not have to worry about spooking centrist voters. But the difficulty of the NDP on the left is a weird funhouse mirror tribute to what Stephen Harper accomplished on the right. Because Harper was able, in the campaigns that he won, especially 2006, well, all of the 3 campaigns that he won, he was able to be credible to a very conservative voter base while being acceptable to a broad center. You know, when I say stuff like that, I always get reminded, well, most Canadians didn't vote Conservative. I'm not saying most Canadians voted Conservative. He was really good at getting enough Canadians to vote Conservative, and that's all you need. Justin Trudeau just won with 39.6% of the vote.
Right. Okay, let's have a quick talk about the Bloc. So, I mean, Gilles Duceppe took over from Mario Beaulieu to save the Bloc. The irony is, of course, that Duceppe lost his seat and Beaulieu won his.
Yeah.
They did win 10 seats, which is what, they were up from 4, I think. But their popular vote went down. So, and I guess, if you think about it, 80% of Quebecers voted for a Federalist Party in this election. So, what does this mean for the Bloc in Ottawa? What does it mean, do you think, for the independence movement in Quebec?
I've got tactical criticisms of how the Bloc spent the last few years. Beaulieu got elected as a rip-snorting real sovereignist whose main critique of the Bloc Québécois was that they hadn't done anything in 20 years to advance sovereignty. And then he became the leader and he went into witness protection. I mean, like apparently he gave interviews to Vice and to BuzzFeed or something like that. That's lovely. But you know, if I was the new leader of a struggling Bloc Québécois, the first thing I would do would be to go to the Globe and Mail and then say something outrageous, so that English Canada would get outraged back, and you'd have something to fundraise on. But you couldn't find Beaulieu for a year and a half with a map and a flashlight, either in Ottawa or in Montreal. And then Duceppe came back, and by that point it was substantially too late. The problem the Bloc Québécois faces is it's not just funny to Federalists, it's serious and existential if you're a sovereignist. The Bloc Québécois exists because sovereignists used to complain about something called double legitimacy, which is the weird divided identity thing of sending Trudeau Liberals to represent Quebec in Ottawa and sending René Lévesque or Jacques Parizeau Sovereignists to represent them in Quebec City. It was seen as sort of unhealthy in a Freudian sense for the Quebecois psyche, that you needed to have the option of sending sovereignists to Ottawa and sovereignists to Quebec City, or you just needed the option at both levels. So now, not only do you have a federalist government in Quebec City and a federalist party that has started to win way more than half of recent elections, with way more than of the popular vote than the PQ, even when the PQ wins. But now you've got a Bloc Québécois supported by the great Pierre-Carl Pelledeau that has lost half of the vote that it had in its historically worst performance last time. And Quebec has just sent 40 Liberals to Ottawa when they had the choice of the Bloc Québécois. And they're not just Liberals, they're Trudeau Liberals. They're Clarity Bill supporting, NICAB permitting, O Canada singing Trudeau Liberals. When you had the option of the Bloc Québécois, there's two generations of sovereignist doctrine that says that's not supposed to be possible. And I believe that party is, well, look, if I was advising the sovereignist movement in good faith with the goal to helping the sovereignist movement succeed, I would say shut down the Bloc this week.
All right. A quick question about the Greens, and then we'll... So just to finish the tour d'horizon. So the Greens, they only won Elizabeth May's seat. The popular vote went down. I was thinking after 10 years of Harper in power, if they couldn't grow faced with a prime minister and a government that certainly didn't have a very positive record on the environment. Is there any, what would make them think that they're going to be anything more than the one-seat party that they have been and they continue to be?
I get along well with Elizabeth May, as everyone does. She's a vibrant personality and knows an awful lot of Canadian political history and parliamentary lore. I think I think including her in the Maclean's debate was a good decision for Maclean's. I was on the other side of that argument, and I'm glad I lost. I do have bosses. I've been pretty critical of her as the Green Party leader going back several years. In 2008, the weird extended game of footsie that she played with the Stéphane Dion Liberals around that campaign was very dispiriting to Green Party members and candidates who they didn't want the Green Party to exist unless there was a better deal with a green tilting Liberal Party. They wanted a Green Party that would always try and fight for Green votes. And Elizabeth May didn't look like that person. And then she showed up at the Parliamentary Press Gallery dinner and made some not very funny jokes in a not very short speech. And there was a lot of criticism. And I wrote a piece that said, it's way worse than a distracted moment at the Parliamentary Press Gallery dinner. It's that she's been around for a decade, she can't win, and that the popular vote for the Green Party has been going down, and that the last leader of the Green Party before Elizabeth May, whose name I think was actually, what's his name? He got a higher share of the popular vote in 2004 than she's gotten in recent elections. And so the Green Party should decide whether it wants to be a party or whether it wants to be a barely functioning life support system for Elizabeth May's parliamentary career. Now look, when you write stuff like that, people say that you're being mean to the Green Party. And I think I have more ammunition now than I did before this election to say, asking members of the Green Party, if there are any left, to think seriously about what's going on with that party is not being mean to them. It's inviting them to enter the world of rationality.
Okay. All right, let's turn our minds forward a little bit, and we'll take maybe another 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So Mr. Trudeau is about to form a government. I wrote down just some of the promises.
Ka-ching.
So let me just run through them quickly. He'll run deficits to invest in infrastructure. He'll amend Bill C-51. He's going to cancel the purchase of the F-35 fighter jets. He's going to end the airstrikes against the Islamic State. He's going to regulate the use of marijuana. He's going to welcome 25,000 refugees by the end of this year. He's going to launch a national public inquiry into the missing and murdered Aboriginal women.
Yeah.
He's going to end the partisan nature of the Senate. He's going to cut taxes for the middle class. He's going to maintain the current level of home delivery of mail. Mm-hmm. He's going to institute a prime minister's question period in Parliament. He's going to end the inappropriate use of omnibus bills the way the Tories did. And he's going to have regular meetings with the premiers. So my question is, which of those commitments do you think he's going to regret most?
I like ending the partisan nature of the Senate. Why didn't I think of that? I was on a panel, I was on CBC Powered Politics yesterday, and Amanda Alvaro, the very capable spokesperson for the Liberal Party on those panels, said he was going to heal the relationship with the First Nations. And I was like, is that in the first 6 months or the second 6 months? I mean, I'm reminded of the weekend that Paul Martin took over as leader of the Liberal Party, and Jacques Chrétien was there and was being gracious about attending Paul Martin's first speech as Liberal leader, even though Paul Martin had a lot to do with Jean Chrétien's retirement as Liberal leader. And I happened to be looking up at Chrétien and Aline Chrétien in the stands as Paul Martin said, I'm going to usher in a new era of cooperation with the provincial premiers. And as proof that this new era has begun, I'm going to meet with them tomorrow at the Grey Cup. And Jean Chrétien just fell out laughing. He'd been such a good boy until that moment. And because he knew that interests, friends are friends, but interests are interests. So that being said, if you have a cabinet of talented cabinet ministers, as I think Trudeau will. There's extraordinary talent among this new crop of members of Parliament. The Dean of Economics at Laval University, the head of the Manitoba Business Council. You just go down the list. And if they're given real autonomy to make decisions, and if they're staffed with strong chiefs of staff from, people from McKinsey and Hill and Knowlton and university faculties and entrepreneurs and so on, and if they have the trust and the cooperation of the civil service, an awful lot is possible, And so even the things that I'm professionally skeptical. Even the things that I roll my eyes at, for all I know, this might have been the last federal election under the first past the post system, because that's my long way around to answering your question. I really look, if you just won 188 seats on 39% of the popular vote,
right.
I think your taste for electoral reform
right.
just plummets.
Right.
But we got him to repeat the promise again yesterday. I got his communications director to repeat it again today. So maybe they plan to do it, and Godspeed. A lot of Canadians would like our electoral system to change.
I think there's been, I think Justin Trudeau during the campaign acknowledged that starting with his dad, there has been increasing centralization of power in the Prime Minister's office.
Yeah.
Do you see that changing in any way? And some of it is the way the media cycle and the media works, the discipline about messaging. Do you really think that's going to change, or are they going to fall back into the same patterns? I mean, obviously, Justin Trudeau did that, went over to the Press Gallery Theatre yesterday. I think that was an important symbolic step. But we've seen leaders before who have said they're going to be more available to the press, and it doesn't last very long.
Yeah, I've seen leaders proclaim their openness. Stockwell Day used to go down and hold a quasi-formal press conference in the basement of the parliamentary center block every day after question period. And eventually, we started asking him hard questions, and suddenly you don't have an exit path. You don't have well, your only exit path is a visible retreat from the, and as you're walking away, we're saying, hey, don't walk away, and you can hear that on TV, and after a while, you stop doing it. I mean, yeah, but I do think, and Trudeau was prime minister today because he became very good at message discipline. He would have these long, open, rambling press availabilities where he'd take a lot of questions, but his answers to each of the questions was something he had rehearsed until he was blue in the face, and most of his lines that sounded spontaneous were things that we had heard before. He rehearses. But I do think that the very brittle relationship that Stephen Harper had with journalists was partly a function of needing to control your message in a modern world where the internet and social media have exploded access to politicians. So it partly mirrors trends that we've seen in the Obama White House, in provincial governments across the country. But it's also partly Stephen Harper's very personal belief that we're out to get him, and his very personal disdain for the practice of journalism in Canada. And I think it's quite easy to loosen things up a fair bit and still have some control over your message. And I expect the work environment between journalists and politicians, including conservative politicians in Ottawa, to thaw quite nicely in this new government.
Okay. Okay, why don't we bring up the lights and we can open this to questions from the audience. Oh, there you all are. Okay. Anyone have a question? Well, no, over here. Go ahead. Yep, Matt.
Thank you so much, Paul. One thing about the new election, or with the election and Stephen Harper stepping down as the leader, he's still going to be the member of Parliament for Calgary Heritage. I'm just wondering about what the dynamic within his party, still being in the House of Commons, as they look for a new leader. I'm wondering about the dynamic that you think there will be.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but are you a conservative?
No.
Okay. Because it's an insightful question, and I hadn't thought much about it until a Conservative member of Parliament said to me, it's going to be like the Progressive Conservatives after Diefenbaker lost the leadership and stayed in caucus for many, many years, plopping himself down at caucus meetings where the party was supposed to talk about renewal. And how can you talk with Mr. Diefenbaker there? And he said, and this is someone who's very fond of Stephen Harper, said, we cannot renew if he's sitting there in caucus. And I believe that that's so obvious that he will, it wasn't obvious to me, but so many things aren't. He will soon announce some kind of setup or situation where his presence in Ottawa will be limited. He'll recuse himself from caucus meetings or something, or he simply won't stay on as an MP for very long, because it's true. This party is literally his creation, and its rhetoric and style are so bound up with the personality of Stephen Harper that I don't know how you have the hard arguments about what a renewed Conservative Party should look like if Mr. Harper is there. There's not a lot of anger at this guy. There's still an awful lot of affection for this guy. But just operationally, like, what's he going to, like, I don't see it working.
Yes, go ahead.
I want to say some words of defense for the Green Party.
Yep.
So the reasons for, in our opinion, why the Green Party hasn't been growing more than it has is very, very simple. For the last election, or for the last several elections, the goal has been to break through when people didn't think the Green Party was being effective. They didn't actually think it would win, so they didn't bother voting for them. And
finally we managed to get her through in San Francisco Island, which was a major victory, which, because the whole party was focused on that one riding, let's get at least one MP in here, and then things will be great. We'll be better anyway. And then a lot of us think it's very clear that what happened this election is that the Canadians were so incredibly fed up with Stephen Harper that it went strategic voting, and that, of course, took the Green Party all but one riding where we had Elizabeth.
Yeah.
So we think that's very, very, very clear. Now we finally got Harper out, thank God, we can move forward. And I'm only speaking, so there's a lot of feeling on that. So the strategic voting, there's a lot of Canadians who have been doing this to break the broken national system. There have been several campaign organizations, Avaz and Lead Now among them, who have been working very hard to coordinate that effort. And the next step is, in our minds at least, is, or at least one of the major steps, is electoral. So,
Okay.
Canada ready for another election anytime soon? Maybe not, but is this something we have to do?
I should check whether the people in the room all can hear the questions and interventions. That was an extended defense of Elizabeth May and of the Green Party decision to try and keep one MP alive in the House of Commons so that they'd have a foothold there and wait for an election where things would get a little looser than they've been in recent elections and break through. That makes as much sense as my snarky put-downs, so, Godspeed. I just note that she's now the longest-serving National Party leader with the departure of Stephen Harper. And at least behind closed doors, it should be possible to question whether this is all working out. On the broader question of electoral reform, I would like a system in which the results more closely match the expressed preferences of voters. And there's a bunch of different ways how that can happen. I note that electoral reform enthusiasm is often dampened when people start to choose among the different reform models. And that it's not just difficult to explain a reform project to people who are used to first past the post. The tendency of reform enthusiasts to radically underestimate the distaste in the broader public for talking about reform proposals consistently dooms reform efforts. Because, so say your thing is mixed member proportional, and I just came home from my rugby match, and I say, well, what's mixed member proportional? And you get about 2 sentences into explaining it, and I say, I don't know what these words mean that are coming out of your mouth. Just every reform enthusiast I've ever seen gets really angry, and that's not the way to persuade people. And so I would advise, as if the Liberal Party is conscientious about following through on its reform promise, I would advise reform enthusiasts to not make the best the enemy of the good. Whatever your super favorite, best ever reform model is, if somebody is advocating a slightly different one, please don't make them your enemy. And if people are distracted, uninterested, and hard to explain your model to, please don't make them your enemy. Because you'll lose, and then you'll spend another decade complaining that our democracy doesn't work. And it's because you'll have done the democracy badly. You need to win arguments. You don't, Anyway.
Go ahead. I'll go over there afterwards, please.
Briefly about foreign policy, Canadian foreign policy under Harper.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering what you have to say, or what your predictions would be about our foreign policy under the Liberals, but specifically under Trudeau, and more specifically, even farther, what are the odds that he's going to follow through with his promise to bring in 25,000 Syrian refugees before the end of the year?
On whether he'll bring in 25,000 Syrian refugees, I think there's a good chance. Although, you know, since he made the promise, I think that just in the nature of things, I think public enthusiasm for as many refugees as fast as possible has gone down. So, you know, we'll see. And the Liberals have a long record of not quite fulfilling their sweeping immigration promises in a bunch of different ways. Eleanor Kaplan used to be the Liberal immigration minister, and she'd announce her immigration targets for this year, and we would say, but Madam Minister, you didn't reach your targets last year. How are you going to reach your targets this year? And she would say, just watch me. And it didn't sound as persuasive coming from her as it did from Pierre Trudeau. On foreign policy more generally, I think this might be one of the places in which the Liberals start to disappoint some of their supporters faster than others. The Liberals have made it crystal clear, including in articles in the Israeli press in Israel, that they intend to have substantially the same position on Israel as a country that the government vocally supports that the Conservatives did. On Ukraine, I have found the accusation that the Harper government is supporting Ukraine and NATO in Central and Eastern Europe against Russia only because there's 1 million Ukrainian voters, insulting to just about all concerned, beginning with the 1 million Ukrainian voters. They're not Pavlov's dogs. They're Canadian citizens who anyway. I know Boris Wisniewski, who just got elected after 4 years in the penalty box in Etobicoke, who is as hawkish on Ukraine as Ted Opitz, the conservative that he beat. I know Chrystia Freeland, who has a house in Ukraine, and her mother's family is from Ukraine, and there's a 50-50 chance she'll be the next foreign minister. She is a anti-Putin hawk down the line. And so if you know, apart from the armed intervention against ISIS, where Trudeau has repeated his intention to bring troops home, bring the fighter teams home from Iraq and the airspace over Syria, in a responsible way, which means slower than you thought he would, but he's still going to do it. I think there's going to be more. I think there's going to be more continuity than contrast in a new Liberal foreign policy, just as I think the amount of change and upheaval in Harper's foreign policy from the Chrétien-Martin precedent was overstated. Well, I could go on, but I think I made my point. I think Canadian foreign policy, the nuances in Canadian foreign policy that upset a few people in Canada go broadly unnoticed by most of our partners abroad.
Yes.
You briefly talked about the conservative leadership and about Jean Charest saying that he doesn't want to do it. And it seems to me like Jason Kenney is the only viable big candidate, but he would very much be more Stephen Harper status quo, which obviously wasn't successful. So who else would serve as a reasonable challenger to him if he's considered to be the front runner?
The thing that Jason Kenney has is several years of 8 events a day on weekends with community groups, largely groups of new Canadians who have never had a politician outside their community speak to them the way he does, remember their names, remember their history and their holy days and their, you know, the way that Kenney has taken care to do. It's not superficial the way he's worked in those communities. It's in a lot of ways, frankly, inspiring to watch. And if so, he's got just squadrons of supporters if he wants to mobilize them. His problem is that just everything I listed among the things that got this Conservative Party into deeper and deeper trouble comes from the Jason Kenney policy kit. NECAB Syrian refugees, revoking Canadian citizenship for dual citizens who are convicted of grave crimes, the barbaric cultural practices snitch line. That's Kennyism. And it's in very bad odor right now in the Conservative Party. So you're right. He's not as obvious a winner as he was. For many years, when people ask me who the next leader of the Conservative Party would be, I would say it will be whoever Pierre Poilievre supports. And it could be Pierre. And people who aren't conservatives, oh my God, oh my God, he's the worst of the worst. He's an idiot. But a conservative party that appeals to real conservatives, to people who think of themselves as conservatives, can't care what its opponents think. And I think there's a good chance the next leader of the Liberal Party will be somebody who is attractive to...
Tory Party.
The Conservative Party. Will be somebody who's attractive to social conservatives, religious conservatives, admirers of Dick Cheney, what have you. That being said, the Ontario Conservatives just elected Patrick Brown as their leader, and he won against formidable opponents, and in early innings, he's been a very impressive leader for the Ontario Conservative Party. And I have known Patrick Brown for 13, 14 years, and I didn't take him seriously for 2 weeks out of those 14 years. Surprising people can come out of nowhere and lead the party, and I think that's likely to happen for this party.
Sure, go ahead. Yes, please.
Hi.
So, I've just been watching some of the elections and following, and my first, instinct when I first heard, I saw, Prime Minister, yes, a Prime Minister-elect, Justin Trudeau, as a white Obama. And, I mean, he's so good at, reaching people and speaking to them. Coming from South Africa and the kind of demographics we have, I was almost looking at it in a decent way, and then I kind of wanted to relate to what was happening in Canada. I love this place, beautiful. Oh, Canada. And I was just wondering whether, there was we talked in some of my courses, and we were covering some of the content that was happening as it was happening. And it would come up in some of our discussions that there wasn't much really being said about First Nation groups and not really knowing, and I completely understand why, the situation, and understanding Canada, and the demographics there. I wondered if it was of any concern or it was noted with any importance. I know you did mention that it was one of the promises, but I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that.
Yep. So the question was about the relative absence of First Nations from the debates in this election, and about what might be possible in terms of helping First Nations with a new government. I'll note generally that there's often a stark difference between things that are important and things that are salient in an election campaign. In other words, things that can move votes because people have a strong sense that one party can do better on addressing a problem that another party could. And Aboriginal relations often aren't salient in Canadian federal elections because people believe that, various remedies have been tried, sometimes half-heartedly, and that one party doesn't get much better results than another. So they're going to go vote on something else. It's not necessarily an indication of a lack of concern. It's an indication of learned helplessness. I believe that Stephen Harper worked fairly diligently to try and achieve concrete improvements in education among First Nations, in the quality of community life, and other things. He was monumentally unimpressed with a lot of the symbolic politics around these things. And because he doesn't really see the utility in meeting anyone, he was not super interested in meeting First Nations leaders either. And that, like everything else, that seemed not to be hurting him until it hurt him a lot. Trudeau. Does anyone know whether Bob Nault got elected up in Kenora?
I think he did.
Yeah, former Jean Chrétien Indian Affairs Minister. Yes. One of the very few sort of old timers in the Liberal Party who ran again and was welcomed by the Liberal camp. There are people in the party who are thoughtful on these issues. There are more First Nations MPs in the Liberal Party than in other parties. There will be a more focused and concentrated attention. So Mr. Trudeau has promised to end boil water advisories in First Nations communities within a fixed amount of time. The first thing that the new Harper government turned its attention to in 2006, with a powerful minister, Jim Prentice, as Indian Affairs Minister, was water quality. And 9 years, they got nowhere. These are remote communities without a lot of obvious sources of potable water, and goodwill doesn't change the physical location of the communities. And so, you're right to point it up as a sensitive place in our politics and as a serious challenge for policymakers. I know the Liberals plan to try hard on it, and I'll be following with some interest how successful they are.
Okay, we're going to give us 10 minutes, so I'd ask you to make your questions precise and concise. Please go ahead. Yep.
I believe anyone but Harper's sentiment goes a long way to explaining why the Liberals ended with a majority and why the NDP ended with half the seats that they expected in the, I spoke to senior NDP campaign officials a week before the vote. They knew they'd lost the election. They were expecting 80 seats, and they got barely half of that. I don't believe that was the result of organized social media campaigns or anything like that, that the organized social media campaigns tend to follow public sentiment rather than, they're mirrors of public sentiment more than motors. I am always suspicious of strategic voting initiatives and campaigns because if I were to try in good faith to figure out who's likely to win and who's their best challenger, my odds of getting it wrong are elevated, and my odds of reaching the opposite conclusion from my next door neighbor are also. I think people go into the ballot box, vote for who they want to form the government. And in the end, the ones who didn't want the Conservatives to stay in government became likelier, with every day in the closing week of the campaign, they became likelier to choose the Liberals over the NDP. I do believe the Conservative lost a little bit of engaged and committed Conservative vote because, like a fraction of the Conservative vote to the Liberals in the home stretch because of disgust with the shambles of the Harper campaign. but it was mostly, French term is vase communicant. The NDP vote was going to go up as the Liberal vote went down, and vice versa. And in the end, it just, I don't think that's the result of an organized effort. It's just people doing the math.
Yes, please.
A few years ago, both Ed Broadbent and Jacques Chrétien publicly mused about the idea of merging the Liberals and the NDP. Given the results of the last election, do you think that's something that may be in the future?
I think it's been pushed further into the future by the results of this election. I have long thought that a formal merger of the NDP and the Liberals would be a good idea, but I have been able to find very few New Democrats or Liberals who agreed with me. The NDP and the Liberal Party in this country are the living laboratory demonstration of the narcissism of small differences. With a relatively centrist NDP leader who used to be a provincial Liberal, and relatively radical Liberal leader who replaced Bob Rae on taxation, on foreign affairs, on a range of issues. You had to be a really engaged political animal to be able to tell which was the Liberal and which was the New Democrat, and yet they hate each other so much. But if the conclusion of that line is that they're going to lose until the cows come home, because they'll be so busy fighting each other, and the Conservatives will come up the middle, and apparently that's not true. So, and say they lost the next election and 20 elections after that, they would both point to this election as proof that they don't have to merge. So.
Okay, anyone over here? Well, please, go ahead.
Someone had to mention it. We all know Trudeau's position on marijuana. Do you think it's going to happen?
Yes. Yeah. The Conservatives, as you will recall, the first thing they went after Trudeau on after he became leader, well, the first thing they went after in an organized way with ad campaigns, and they ran ads on radio for a year about Trudeau as a purveyor of pot to the innocent children of the land. In heavy rotate, like they went after him on marijuana harder than they went after Stéphane Dion on anything. And it got nowhere. And I think it's because public opinions are changing. Ferran Ellis at the University of Lethbridge, or Lethbridge College, a political scientist down there, does a lot of polling of attitudes on social questions among Albertans. And Ferran is a movement conservative, was active in the Reform Party, was active in Wild Rose. But he has measured that support for open access to abortion has been growing. Support for same-sex marriage in Alberta has been growing. Opposition to capital punishment in Alberta has been growing. And support for legalized marijuana has been growing in Alberta. The ballot initiatives in a few states in the United States where decriminalization or legalization of marijuana. I'm not a consumer, so I'm bad on the nuances between decriminalization and legalization. But those ballot initiatives passed without difficulty, and I think it's like same-sex marriage. The modern Conservative Party, the two legacy parties merged and formed a new party to be more competitive with the Liberal Party, largely because the Liberal Party was the party of legalizing same-sex marriage in 2002 and 2003. And now, a decade later, if you had a vote in the Conservative caucus, 4 months ago when there still was a Conservative caucus, they would have voted to maintain same-sex marriage. The society just passed them by. And surprisingly to me, social attitudes on marijuana have been changing or at least on the legal treatment of marijuana, have changed very rapidly in the last few years. I think Trudeau will legalize marijuana. He won't have much difficulty, including many foreign policy problems with the U.S. administration. It'll just be something that happens.
All right, I'm looking around. Well, no, up in the back there, in the orange. Yeah.
Yep.
With Trudeau and a large part of Western Canada staying conservative and the distrust of the Liberal Party by a large part of Western Canada, do you think Trudeau has an opportunity to change that perception in Western Canada? Or is the relationship going to stay lukewarm at best when there's a Liberal government in Ottawa?
I don't think he'll change it much. I think he's already had extraordinary success getting 2 Liberals elected in Calgary and 2 in Edmonton. I know some of those candidates, and I wouldn't have voted for one of them. So, but their neighbors did. But no, Chrétien had several MPs west of the Lakehead in his first mandate, and a lot fewer in his second mandate. I don't think that the rocky ground the Liberals find themselves on in Alberta and in Saskatchewan is open hostility, or it's not a Red Lake Rebellion kind of thing. It's frostiness. I don't think people in Alberta are despondent that we have a Liberal government coming in. It's just not their preference, and I think it'll largely continue not to be their preference.
Okay, well, all right, one last question and that's it. We're going to have to go.
As a Liberal,
Yeah.
there's certain parts of my politics that I think conservatively a little bit. And the last weekend of elections, before elections, I saw Stephen Harper hitch his wagon to Ford Brothers. And for me, that was like, whoa. Like, how did you feel as a news reporter seeing that, like, develop?
I find it incomprehensible that Stephen Harper went twice to the side of Rob Ford in the last week of his last election campaign. Harper is viscerally anti-drug abuse. He worked hard to reduce criminality through policies that he thought would do good on that front. He is personally extraordinarily disciplined. He does drink alcohol, but very few people have ever seen him finish a drink. He's plainly has no idea how addiction functions, as we see through his contempt for supervised injection sites for hard drug users in Vancouver and elsewhere. He likes to discuss public policy seriously. He's not much of a sport. Like, there's nothing about him that's like Rob Ford. There's nothing about him, you know? The 2 explanations I have, one is a little far-fetched. It was just an expression of id. He knew he was going to lose, and he just wanted to do this thing. He wanted to not worry about what the effect, after a decade of worrying about the electoral and political effect of things, about the way that what he said would sound, he rehearsed every public appearance he ever made. He would rehearse not only the prepared part, but he would rehearse the questions and answers, and he would look over the guest list to make sure the right people were there. And I think maybe at the end he just said, I'm just going to do this thing. I'm just going to do this thing where I stand next to the guy that he was in photos and people got shot who were in the photos. And, it's just the thing I'm going to do, So that's the thing I'm not 100% sure of. And the thing I am quite sure of is that if you know anything about Harper, he was born in Leaside, Ontario, and moved to Edmonton before moving on to the University of Calgary. If you know one more thing about Harper, it's that his family moved from Leaside to Etobicoke when he was in middle school and high school, and then he left home and moved to Edmonton. So he went to Richview Collegiate in Etobicoke, which is 3.9 kilometers from the venue of that rally last Saturday night. And I think he just wanted to be home. It's in his fight with Kathleen Wynne, in the way he campaigned in Ontario, not just as a politician who wanted to win in Ontario, but as someone who really felt like he was at home. The particular interest he takes in Ontario politics, the way he endorsed John Tory as provincial Conservative leader and Kathleen Wynne twice, Tim Hudak twice against Kathleen Wynne and Dalton McGuinty. I believe I've attached too much importance to Harper as an Albertan. I think he's a suburban Ontarian at heart. He left Ontario when he was 19. And I think when things were going really bad, he wanted to be where he grew up. I think it's that human. And if Rob Ford was going to be there, that was the price of going home.
Okay, so thank you, Paul. It was great. So obviously we could have carried on the conversation. I think Paul would be prepared to take a little bit of time to talk to the people who didn't get to ask their questions. Thank you all for coming. Please make sure you've got on your calendars the Edward Snowden Donald lecture that's coming up. Obviously he's not going to be here in person, but I think it's going to be a fascinating evening, so I encourage you to be there, and thank you all for coming tonight. Well done.